Century 14 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're cleared hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Welcome back to Tactical Tangents. This is Mike. This episode is brought to you by Right-On Optics. Right-On is bringing you high-quality glass at a great value. I use and trust their scopes, binoculars, and red dot sights, and you can too with their unconditional lifetime warranty. If you ever have a problem with their gear, they will replace it, not repair it. Finish up your next build and keep a little extra cash on hand for ammo so you can actually go out and shoot that thing. Find your next optic at rightonoptics.com.
And this is Jim. This episode is also brought to you by Dry Fire Mag. Ammo is getting hard to find these days, and you need to stay proficient by working your dry fire training. Dry Fire Mag solves the common and annoying problem in dry fire training of constantly having to rack the slide to reset the trigger. With this thing, all you do is clear your weapon, load the training magazine, and get to work. Check them out at dryfiremag.com.
So tonight we're going to build on the series of medical podcasts that we've done. We've done a bunch of these, and they're all there's overlap in all of them, and they're building blocks to the bigger picture, right? We did a trauma, just kind of an introduction with Dr. Tang, where we talked about a variety of topics related to trauma surgery and EMS related stuff. That was years ago. And more recently, we did a kind of a primer on trauma care that I did, I think it's a solo one, right, Jim? I think I did that while you were out of town or something.
Probably.
And then we've also done a couple others where we talked about things like dropping people off in a police car and that sort of thing. And tonight, we're going to build on that by getting into triage, mass casualty incidents and things like that. And a topic that is very closely related to triage is also that of rescue task force, which is kind of a new concept here in the U.S. I mean, it's not that new anymore, but people are just it's starting to get more mainstream. It's starting to become more, less conceptual, more real, I guess, is kind of where I'm going with that. And we talked about this in the Columbine episode that we did a little bit, where police and fire resources are mixing together to go into a warm zone to start rendering care and triaging people and eventually move into that more traditional or conventional triage mass casualty sort of scenario. So that's kind of linked to all of this.
And when we talk about this stuff, fight the urge to kind of turn off your brain and say, oh, well, we have EMTs for that and paramedics for that, or that's the medic's job on the team. What you're going to find with big, serious medical problems is sometimes they ain't there and it's you, or they are overwhelmed and it's all hands on deck trying to take care of this crisis, right? So everyone has a role to play in medical stuff. And my little tactical editorial on this is that the odds of you getting in a real gunfight, even if you're a cop, are relatively low, if we're being honest. The odds of you seeing someone really, really hurt are actually pretty high. And so you need to be prepared to handle medical stuff. And that's the whole range of medical stuff. That's everything from a bad cut from falling on the curb because you tripped over your own feet because you're me, or a multiple car pileup, or a mass casualty, mass shooting, mass violence event kind of thing. You need to be prepared for that whole spectrum of medical care.
And where this comes into play is we do a pretty good job of teaching and learning medical stuff, especially for trauma, at a very, very basic level. At that first responder or even, bystander, personal defense, civilian or citizen level, trauma care is super basic and it's not hard. I mean, it's pretty accessible to get training in that, right? Which is cool.
Blood goes round and round, air goes in and out, make those things happen, and things are good. Put a tourniquet on it, pack it, put pressure on it, right? That's what you get taught.
Yeah, and the Stop the Bleed courses now are everywhere. I mean, it's so easy to go and get this training, and the kit is not terribly expensive, and you can, it's out there. And the guys and gals that are in a field where maybe it's not medical, but they might see this stuff on a frequent basis, the ones who care about their job do a pretty good job of finding most of that on their own. And where this really comes into play, like Jim is saying, is when the situations start to overwhelm either you and your abilities or your kit, maybe, or more big picture, they start to overwhelm the system, right? The other resources that might be coming to something like this.
Yeah. So anytime we talk about overwhelm as it relates to first aid, where we're headed is talking about mass casualty. And there are different definitions depending on context for mass casualty incident or event. But for our purposes on this podcast, it is anytime you have more injured people than you have the resources to deal with. How many is that? I think you'd be shocked at how small that number really is. If you have one ambulance on the scene, 2 seriously injured people is enough to overwhelm that ambulance. Now think about 2 cars in a wreck with a total of 4 or 6 people in them. You have more people hurt than you have paramedics on scene, usually as they first get there, right?
And the other thing about being overwhelmed is there's a cognitive component to it as well. So maybe these patients aren't that bad, or maybe the treatment for what they need is pretty straightforward. Like it's serious, but it's manageable. But you are overwhelmed kind of internally to deal with that, right? And one of the things that came up for us when we did some training a little while back, some of the Air Force pararescuemen close to where I work put us through some courses, and we had a bunch of guys that would have a patient and they'd be like, okay, your ambulance is 10 minutes away. And these guys would have like 3 or 4 minutes of work to do. And so there's like 6 or 7 minutes left. And they're like, now what? Like I've done everything I know how to do. Now what do I do? And in some of those cases, there might not be anything else to do, but there's a mental component to this where like, well, I really want to help. I really want to do something. And so what is it that you could do? And the thing about trauma care is sometimes it's really, really simple stuff. It's maybe if you get them out of the building, out to the street, so that the loading up time and getting them, off the X as it were, or into the ambulance and on the road, you didn't get to use your fancy kit, but you got them out to the street and that saved, maybe
Packaged
several
up,
minutes.
ready
right?
to move.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's little things like that where, again, just cognitively, we struggle sometimes with, I don't know what to do with my hands. And that's what you got to kind of work through.
And there's always work to do, right? If you're just sitting there, you're probably doing something wrong. You need to, start thinking about how do I solve the next problem? If nothing else, talk to them, right? Hey, bud, you're going to be okay. Talk to me. What you got? I don't know if you're going to play the piano again, but for right now, you just worry about breathing and staying with me, right? That sort of thing.
And there's a flip side to that too, which is sometimes there's enough work that it seems like you never get to see past the end of some of the basic stuff. This is the part that you have to figure out because there's plenty of work to do, and it might be something big, like big, Las Vegas mass shooting big, or it could be just, a Honda Civic that rolled over on the freeway and there's 4 people and some of them are stuck and I can't get all of them out. And again, I don't know what to do with my hands because I want to use my really cool kit, but I can't get them out of the car to use it. And oh my God, what do I do with my hands? And there's a lot of really good things you can do with that. And it starts just with having a basic scene size up. Okay, I've got this many people. Some of them are trapped. I can't get to them. I need to communicate that to the people who can help. That can go a really long way in resolving this, right?
So when you are overwhelmed, one of the very first things that you need to do is you got to kind of pick your battles. You got to figure out what task am I going to do right now? And that's fundamentally prioritizing your efforts, right? Take this giant overwhelming situation and get it down to one task that you can do right this second. That's prioritization. And in a medical context, that is triage. Triage literally means sort. So that's what you got to do. More people than you can treat, you need to allocate your resources where they can do the most good. You don't spend all your time working on the dead guy. You don't spend all your time working on the guy who is fine and talking about wanting to eat something. You find the person who really, really needs the help right goddamn now, and you work on that person.
And there's a lot of models for that. I'll touch on that in a very, very basic way, because we're not going to go into the models of triage, because you can Google that. And frankly, if you're working in a place where triage is something that you're likely to have to do in a very organized or formal way, then you're going to want to be on board with whatever system your agency or your organization is using. But the idea is you've got patients that are spread out over all these, across the freeway, in a car or whatever, and getting everyone out and organized in a way where I can look at these patients one by one and figure out what's wrong with them and what I can do about it. Just that by itself goes a long way in getting yourself under control, right? If you have that overwhelming feeling. And too often we focus on triage in this algorithmic way. And on one hand, those algorithms, these decision-making trees, are great on a whiteboard because you can conceptualize, okay, this is the order, or these are the priorities that I should do certain things in. That's fine on a whiteboard. But the problem is when you have that cognitive overload, you lose the focus that you need to really stick to that. Another element of that is, even if you look at something like March is a pretty common patient assessment algorithm for trauma care, and it's massive bleeding, airway, respiration, circulation, head and hypothermia. We covered that in the episode we did on trauma, but if you've ever heard of that, it's a good way of sort of prioritizing your efforts and starting in order of, okay, what do I need to look for next? Well, sometimes you never get past the M, right? The massive bleeding part of it. Someone is bleeding so bad and you go and you put direct pressure on that wound and you're stuck. That's the only thing you're ever going to get to. You never get past M. And so how good did the rest of the algorithm do for you? This is especially important in a triage scenario because you might be putting all of your effort, like Jim said, into that one dead or dying person when there's 5 or 6 or a dozen or maybe 20 or 30 other people that need your help. So what we got to do is figure out a way to ground ourselves in that process and say, okay, I have a model for this. I have a concept. I have an idea of what this should look like. And then find a way to have the discipline to circle back and go, okay, I'm getting real focused in this one area. So how do I bring that, how do I break that decision-making logjam and get down to work, right?
Yeah, and the classic expression here is the forest and the trees. And it's great to hear, oh yeah, you need to have the forest and the trees, but this is where you have to put that as part of your algorithm. Hey, every couple of minutes, stop, pop your head up, look around, figure out what's going on around you, right? And consider when and where this really takes effect. Are you in a situation where you can even sort in a meaningful way? That usually means a cold zone, right? Where the scene is fundamentally safe, or at least a warm zone, some sort of casualty collection point. If you're under fire, this is moot. Return fire, win the fight, right? In that initial assessment of the casualty, when the situation is still hot, sort out, can they move on their own? Can they do a little self-care? Can you make the scene safe or get them to a safe enough scene for further care?
Yeah, and that kind of takes us to the last big thing, which this is one of those areas where we think in sometimes really big terms. We're thinking the school bus full of kids instead of just, like I said earlier, you've got a Honda Civic that rolled over on the freeway and there's 3 or 4 patients, but only 1 or 2 of you. And that medium stuff, kind of that intermediate level, it's not the large scale mass casualty incident where I have a ton of resources that are going to start rolling in. Because let's face it, those mass casualty incidents are difficult to manage. But you only have to manage them for so long before things start to get under control and you have help coming, right? Those medium incidents, those intermediate incidents where, okay, it's only 3 or 4 or 6 patients and 3 or 4 or 5 of us, so we're a little outnumbered here. That's where you learn. That's where you learn how to focus on those principles, right? Whether it's a model or an algorithm or just basic principles, right? And we're going to talk about some principles. That's where we're headed with all of this. But the reason I bring it up is because at the big mass casualty stuff, that's where like the battalion chief of the fire department's getting out the red and yellow and green tarps, and everyone's going to get sorted into a certain category, and you're getting the triage tags out and tagging people. And the thing is like, we don't usually ever get to that point. And if you're at the point where you're taking out triage tags and writing on them, we're talking about like a much bigger problem logistically, which as we'll talk about going further into this is a logistics problem, right? But more importantly, thinking past or I should say not past the logistics, but before we even get to the logistics, we have to deal with the humans, right? The human element of this, which is, how do I just start to wrap my head around what needs to happen next? So sometimes we think about, well, in the incident command system, we have to have a logistics person. There's a medical team director. There's a transport team director. There's this director, that director, the other director, all these, firefighters and EMS people with different helmets and hats, and they've got the reflective vests with the labels on them and all this stuff, right? Before we ever get to that, I need the dummy cop or the dummy fireman that shows up first or second or third on scene to be able to know what to do next and what are the 2 or 3 things to do after that. Sometimes those steps are the most important in steering the outcome of this event.
And as far as that goes, and the cart and the horse, part of that is the scene size up. Look around you when you first show up. Figure out what's going on. Is the scene safe? Is it safe enough that I can bring rescue resources in? Or do I need a lot more cops to make the scene safe, right? Is there an ongoing hazard? Is there a plume of toxic shit that's going to drop on us while we're working out here? That all has to be part of the first couple of guys who walk up. And just like as Mike is saying, the scalability of this, both in number of people, number of victims, and of time, I wish I could prepare you for every conceivable scenario. What we know is there are most likely scenarios. Every city is going to have car wrecks every day, all day long. And once a week, once a month, once a year, there's going to be some bigger incident than that, right? A major shooting, a big pile-up car wreck, a train derailment, something like that. And then once a decade, or in some cases once a century, you're going to have that big mass, like, oh my God scenario, the 9/11 kind of thing, right? And you have to have your brain around every level of that scale. And hopefully you thought about it before that day comes, right? So like Mike mentioned, there's a fundamental logistics problem here. Who do I transport first? And how do I transport them? We eventually have to get these people to care. Like, that's the goal, right? We've talked about this in prior trauma episodes, that it's great that you know how to put on a tourniquet or that you know how to do CPR, and that's awesome. But ultimately, what most of these people are going to need is a doctor and whole blood and an OR. So you have to start thinking right away, as part of your scene size up, how am I going to get these people moved? And the standard answer is an ambulance or a helicopter. And that's great if you can get the ambulance there. But what happens when it's 20 people or 50 people? Can you throw 20 people in the back of a pickup truck and just go? Can you marshal a bunch of pickup trucks? Can you get a bus, like a school bus? These are the things you got to start thinking about, and the problem solving you got to start doing right away. And the longer it takes you to start figuring that out, the worse the outcome's going to be.
And as far as, so what Jim is talking about in terms of problem solving, and again, yes, it's a logistics issue, but dealing with that just feeling overwhelmed and cognitive load stuff, one thing that we want to be careful about is on those medium or kind of intermediate, lesser mass casualty type of incidents, typically those get resolved because in a metropolitan area, in a well-populated area, you're only by yourself and overwhelmed for a couple of minutes before, the world starts showing up. And then before you know it, things just kind of sort themselves out, right? And what I want you to think about is those minutes in between where things hadn't been sorted out yet. those are the times that you have to go back and really look critically at these incidents and do a good debrief, and not just let the fact that all's well that ends well, we got the help eventually. That's not how you learn. And the problem with thinking about it in those terms and not going down the what if path is when that big one happens and you've never had to learn from those major, those smaller events, the major ones become a whole lot more difficult to manage. So don't use luck as a tactic. Really go through and try to learn from those smaller events, because when you have to perform in something like your Super Bowl, the big one, that might only happen once or twice in your career, right? And so you want to be ready for that. So let's talk about some just basic principles that will apply in any kind of trauma scenario. And we'll try to hit some points along the way that really drive home how to apply those things in a mass casualty sort of setting. But the first one is that trauma is trauma. Nothing about your treatment and trauma care has changed because there are multiple patients and because you have your hands full, right? The same things that are going to kill that person, in each individual patient, the same thing is going to kill them that was going to kill them if they were by themselves. And those life-saving interventions that you have available to you are still generally the same thing. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's a whole bunch of triage models out there. There's SALT, there's RPM, respirations, perfusion, mental status. There's several different ways. START triage is another one. There's several different ways you can look at that kind of algorithm. But what you have to understand is if you have a very good understanding of trauma care and the whole spectrum of time is life, right? The internal bleeding can't be stopped out in the field. The external bleeding, if stopped early, can save lives. And these are your basic interventions and all of that. If you have a really good handle on those things, that goes a long way in steering your triage. You can look at something and say, okay, I recognize what this is. I know what this person needs. Or you might be able to say that, all right, this person is circling the drain, and quite frankly, it is going to be way too long to get this person help, and there's nothing really that I can do to help them. And if you wrap your head around those things, that is essentially trauma, right? When you say that someone is deceased or expectant versus immediate, those are categories that most of those trauma or triage systems will use. An immediate patient is something that, hey, this is like our top priority for the person that's going to get transported out. Someone who is expectant is probably going to die, or they're already dying, right? Dead and
literally
dying.
What it means, you expect them to die regardless of what you do, right?
And that's a hard thing as a provider. You're sitting there trying to save people's lives and all that, but you got to wrap your head around the fact that, look, given this scenario, it's going to be at least an hour or 2 or 3 before I can get this person where they have to go. This building collapse thing, I can't bring ambulances over here right now. It is what it is. So if you understand that, then that informs your decision making. You go, okay, I really want to help this person. They'd probably make it if they were the only person, but I'm going to have to move on. There's still 20 other people that I have to go look at, right? If you understand that, you're on the right path. So trauma is trauma. Your treatment, your life-saving interventions don't change fundamentally just because there are multiple patients.
And it's one thing to understand cognitively that, according to your algorithm, hey, this person isn't worth my time and effort right now. And that's, there's an emotional component there, right? Especially when there are bystanders who are not part of your solution, maybe family members of that person who are saying, hey, come help my dad, come help my mom. And you have to have the objectivity and the professionalism to say something to them and then get to work on what you can do, right?
And also understand it doesn't mean you can't come back to them. It doesn't mean that, hey, if I go make a round and I touch more patients and I figure out that, hey, this is the most serious and the only one really that needs to get out of here in a big hurry that is going to die otherwise, then maybe they become your top priority. But the whole idea here is that you have to sort through the patients. You have to do the greatest good for the greatest number. That is the concept in triage. Any one of those models that you look at, that's what they're based upon, is doing the greatest good for the greatest number. If you read between the lines there, that means understanding that you cannot save them all. And so you have to make peace with that. That's mass casualty stuff. This is ugly stuff, right? This is not your normal, oh, the guy is in a car crash, we're going to do our best. This is something bigger than that, right? That being said, when you look at your skill set, if you're an EMT or a paramedic or a cop or a fireman, whatever your skill set is, whatever the list of things, be honest with yourself. Go through and say like, all right, these are the things that I can do that can probably save someone's life. Packing a wound and tourniquet application, if it's one of those two things, those are life-saving interventions that if you get the opportunity to do them, go ahead and take the time to do them, right? External hemorrhage control all day long, that's kind of a gimme. There's a lot of things that providers at those levels, even EMT and paramedic, that they're probably capable of doing that in the grand scheme of things might not make that big of a difference. A King airway, for example, like, I could drop a tube down this guy's throat, but at the point that he needs that, he's on a pretty short clock most of the time to be able to survive whatever that was. Starting an IV, is that a life-saving intervention? Usually not, especially if we're talking about trauma and internal bleeding. That's probably not one of those skills that you should burn a lot of time doing if there are other people that need more serious help, right? This is something that on some level, very basic level, treatment is the best thing. If you're the bystander, the cop, or maybe even the EMT, where you don't really have a lot of things in your bag of tricks, it's perfect because there's really only 3 or 4 things you could do anyway. And so go ahead and do them and then move along. Where this gets really challenging is at that like paramedic level provider where you've got all kinds of stuff. And really what you need to do is essentially have the, dare I say, humility to say, yeah, I know I'm really smart and I have all this cool stuff that I could do, but it's not really worthwhile right now. And that can be hard. That takes a lot of discipline.
And there's something to be said, depending on what sort of situation you have, if you have less injured people, make them part of your solution, right? You can coach them through, hey, you stand here, hold this, keep pressure on this. And you might be able to do a lot more good coaching 5 people than trying to do 5 tasks yourself.
Yeah. And that's the thing is if you keep it simple, that's manpower. You have manpower there. Use it. Hey, if someone's bleeding, I want you to put direct pressure on it. Do that. If someone has facial injuries that's blocking their airway, sit them up. Simple stuff like that. Positioning someone well so that they're not choking on their own blood. You put them in a way that they're leaning forward and that blood can drain out of their mouth and they could probably keep breathing and keep managing their own airway until you come back around or it's their turn in line, right? So basic stuff like that usually goes a really long way. And it's important that we look at, okay, these are the basic interventions that I can do and which ones of these are really worth my time. Positioning someone is a great example. It requires 0 training, right? Just sit them up. So working through triage, going through patient to patient to patient, what you're trying to do is prioritize your patients, get a good accounting for what you got. Okay, I've got this many patients. This many of them just have minor stuff, a broken arm. You could just work with that for a little while. These people are probably going to die, and these people are the real serious. These are the first ones to go. Making those priorities is really what you're trying to do at the first stage of this. So if you understand trauma and you look at, all right, I know what to do with one patient. Now I just have 5 or 6 or 10 to deal with. You start to look at that from 30,000 feet and go, all right, these 2 right here, those are the ones that I'm going to focus my time and energy on. Once they're gone, I'm going to go to those ones over there. These people can kind of wait, and those 2 over there are going to die, so I'm not going to worry. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, right? That is essentially what your objective is on that first pass. This is Mike, and I just want to jump in real quick to announce our new partnership with Brink Drones. Brink has created life-saving capabilities in a drone that can break windows, fly into houses and confined spaces, and even crash into things and stay in the air with advanced pilot assistance that does not use GPS. Brink drones are built in the USA. It has night vision and IR that can function in blacked out and zero light conditions. It can flip itself back over, and it is a flying cell phone with two-way communication and a live video feed. It can even carry and drop off items for hostage negotiators with the payload feature. Brink has a really cool and compelling heritage that came to be after the 1 October mass shooting at Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas, and they are committed in their mission to leverage technology to save lives. And I can tell you firsthand that their drones will do just that by flying into places that are too dangerous to risk human lives. If you work in public safety, your agency needs to see what this drone can do. Go check out Brink Drones at brinkdrones.com, or feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to tell you all about them. Again, that's Brink, BRINC, drones.com.
Yeah, Mike, I want to hit on one thing. We kind of mentioned earlier about having victims be part of the solution, right? Give people tasks. Depending on how hurt they are or how not hurt they are, putting them to work can be one of the best things you can do for them, right? There's some important psych there. You're giving victims some control back. You're giving them something to do. When you do that, though, you have to be very, very specific. What is your name? Okay, Tim. Bobby here's bleeding really bad. I need you to keep pressure on this part of his leg until a doctor tells you not to. Okay, Bobby. Tim here needs to move about 100 yards that way so the ambulance can move him. Good luck. Yeah. Help each other out, right?
This is, so there's some good points in this, actually. Putting people to work is absolutely worthwhile. When you say until a doctor tells you not to, I picture like the guy in a meme somewhere that like a paramedic comes up and says, take your hand off. I need to look at that. No, he said not until a doctor tells me to. You're not a doctor. But yeah.
You know, I have a story about this, right? Because of course I have a story about, there's a reason I said it that way. So this one time in the military, I had an airman deglove a finger, which was nasty. And he was holding pressure on it, and then everyone wanted to see it. So the first sergeant came by, was like, what happened to your hand, son? And the guy opens up his hand, and it starts gushing out blood.
Blood's going squirting across the room.
And he puts pressure back on. He can't figure out why it won't stop bleeding. Then the the operations superintendent came by and was like, what happened to your hand, buddy? And he opens up his hand and
check this out.
Shows his finger, keeps bleeding. The squadron commander came by and was like, hey, what happened? Oh yeah, and he opens up his hand, and keeps bleeding, and I'm like, this kid's gonna like bleed to death through his finger if we don't do something here. And so I went and got all Ranger Ricky on the guy and was like, okay, we're gonna bandage you up, you're gonna hold pressure on this, and I don't want you to take pressure off until a doctor tells you not to. So the true story, I really did have to do that. That was one of 2 orders I've given in the military. Was that?
That's funny. Yeah. So, but let's talk just more about incorporating victims and enlisting victims as help. So one of the common approaches to dealing with triage in some of those models that I talked about is you start with saying, hey, if you're able to walk, I want you to come over here to me, right? You walk into a scene and there's a bunch of people, everyone that's able to walk, I want you to come over here and sit in this field or on these bleachers or on the curb or in this hallway, whatever it is. And what have you just done? You've gotten everyone, okay, if they were able to get up and walk and follow those directions and follow my instructions over to this area, they're obviously not hurt all that bad. So those are my lower priority patients. And then you start with, okay, how many people, if you need help, raise your hand. All the people are raising their hand, right? They're able to wave to you. All right, well, you might not be able to move, but you can wave, so you're obviously not that bad. It's those people not talking and not responding. That's where you start, right? And that's where you start to sort, all right, these are my top priorities, and if they're dead or you expect them to die, then they're black. If they are otherwise salvageable, then they become immediate. Those are your top priorities. The people who are non-ambulatory, i.e. not able to walk, not able to get up, but they're otherwise responsive, those are going to come later. They're delayed. And then you have your walking wounded. Those are the people that are able. That's one simple approach to this, right? You can take that a step further. Like Jim said, you can give them things to do. Hey, can you put direct pressure on this? It might even be something like, can you tell me how many people are hurt? Right? I need a list of the people that are hurt and where they're hurt. And I don't need it right now because I have to go look for other people to help. But when the next group of medics come through here, they're going to want to know who's in here and what are their injuries. So can you make them a list and help us figure that out? It might be something like just an ability to communicate. Hey, I'm going to leave you this radio. If this person stops talking, then I want you to call me, or whatever it is. The whole idea is absolutely put them to work. And if they're able to help you move people, then that's cool. You might have that, right? And sometimes, like Jim said, you give them some control back, but you put them to work and now they feel like they're helping. That can do a number of benefits for those people. And don't think for a second that going through something like this, there's the physical damage of trauma, but also that whole all the emotional stuff, right? And, moving people might be as simple as like, all right, sit someone on an office chair and push them down the hall to the elevator, right? Yeah, maybe you're not asking them to carry anybody, but they can push them in a chair, right? That's not that big of a deal. So you might even enlist one of those people to be your elevator guy. Hey, I want you to stay right here at the elevator, so every time we come up for a person, you can take us to the next one. You know where everybody is. Something silly like that, right?
I picture the scene from Under Siege, which is probably before y'all's time, where Steven Seagal hands the stripper the submachine gun. Is like, if he says someone coming around, you shoot him. Like, hey, yeah, whatever.
But yeah, it works. It worked in the movie, so it's got to work in real life.
So yeah. So somewhere in here, think about what transport time is going to mean as far as how much time you have to work on these people, right? So in the context of a combat environment, I might have a helicopter hovering overhead and get the guy out right away, or I might be stuck for 15 hours with these people. There are a lot of interventions I'm willing to try if I'm sitting there watching someone circle the drain for 15 hours that I wouldn't be willing to try if the helicopter's en route.
And don't think that when Jim says combat, that you are outside the realm of austere field care potentially with you and your family. Think about something like Hurricane Katrina. You're up on your roof with "Help Me" painted on your thing, and the place is flooded, and you're hoping that a helicopter is going to fly over sometime in the next several days.
I'll tell you what, you want to learn a life-changing story? There's a book called 5 Days at Memorial by Sherry Fink. It is a hell of a story about a hospital that got stuck in Hurricane Katrina and what they did and what they couldn't do for the people in the hospital. It is crazy.
And prolonged field care is something that's maybe a little bit different than triage, but it's still, we're talking unorthodox here. We're talking unconventional. We're talking not normal. Absolutely. And that still applies. So when it comes to triage and you understand trauma care and what to do with one individual, two individual patients, something like that, really what you have to wrap your head around is doing the greatest good for the greatest number. What you don't want to do is spend so much time working on one person who is likely going to die that you neglect the several other that you might be able to help. That is fundamentally what you're trying to accomplish in triage.
Yeah, and that's philosophically and ethically weird, right? This is why you get paid the big bucks. You're trying to do the most good for the most people, and you're trying to apply fundamentals even when things get weird. And this is a situation where, by its nature, is going to get weird.
It's true. And so where do you take this, right? Where you take this is you're going to go and you're going to start looking at this problem. Go, what do I got to do here? And what I want you to think about is forcing yourself to only spend maybe 30 seconds or a minute on each patient until you have a good accounting of what you're looking at, until you have a good accountability for your patients, which is going to take me to my next big principle. First one, trauma is trauma. The second one is accountability. So accountability is a big key in managing a mass casualty problem is communicating what resources you need and then bringing those resources to you in an organized way to get those people to help. And so having a good account of this is how many people I have, these are how severe the injuries are, so that the people that are coming to help you can start to wrap their own heads around it. And all the places that they're going to eventually go, the hospitals, the receiving facilities, they can start prepping for that influx because they're probably going to be overwhelmed at some point too. And you want to get ahead of that. The earlier you get ahead of that, the better, right? So the other part of accountability is understanding, again, this is a logistics problem. So it's things like, what supplies do you have on you? What things can you improvise with? One of the things that one of my big pet peeves is when people put tourniquets on injuries that don't require tourniquets. Because oftentimes, cops and military guys, they might have a tourniquet or two on their person. And if they use that on an injury that doesn't require it, now they're down a tourniquet. And you might end up needing that later in a much more compelling way. Now, tactical scenarios are a little bit different because when bullets are flying, you want to go to your tried and true, your most reliable fix to those kinds of things, right? But if you think about a car wreck, for example, or a train derailment, or something where there are several patients and you have one or two tourniquets, and you go to the first guy that's bleeding and you go, well, it's a tourniquet, it's mass casualty, I'm just going to throw it on, right? Well, that's great, except now you went from having two tourniquets to one, and so you hope you don't need more than one more, right? So logistically, you use what is absolutely necessary, and if you could stop certain things with just a pressure bandage or something like that, maybe you should do that, because you're going to find that you're going to start to run low on supplies. One of the biggest things as far as logistics goes when it comes to this is how to move people. So if you have a stretcher, for example, and you have a stretcher, which one person do you move with that? Because you're going to be without it for a while, potentially. So start with accountability, again, logistics, and make sure that you have a clear sight picture, if you will, of what you have, and communicate that so you can bring in the appropriate resources.
Yeah, this is an important point, right? This is fundamentally a logistics problem. And I want you to think about that in the initial 911 call. You need to say the words mass casualty, because it will tend to cue them into the severity and the need for resources.
Yep, that's absolutely right. And one of the best ways that you have that in your head is to get that balcony view and to recognize, like, as soon as you can pull that trigger or hit that button, right? The mass casualty button, because no one wants to hit the big red button. No one wants to be the guy that calls and makes a mountain out of a molehill and says, oh, this is this is whatever. But if you can clearly and in a compelling way say, okay, this is exactly what we have. We have 16 patients, right? And maybe you even have categories for them or something like that. Red, green, yellow. And you sound that alarm and you send that out in the call. Now the guys responding are thinking about, okay, well, we should probably let the hospitals know, because that's a big number. We should probably start thinking about on-scene stuff, because sometimes EMS crews, they're going to a scene to pick up a guy and leave. They're not really planning on hanging out for a while. And so maybe you need to bring in resources that are, hey, you're going to be digging in here for a little bit, because we only have so many ambulances to start moving these people out of here, right? So there's a whole chain of events that comes with just getting that initial call out that says, this is what this is, right? To get that balcony view, it's important that you not get tunnel vision on any one thing. So to have that accountability, to get a good assessment, if you find yourself heads down on any one patient for longer than that 30 to 60 second window that we talked about, you're probably missing stuff. And those are things that if you're the first person on this incident, or the first person that's able to, effectively communicate the big picture to someone, you have to force yourself to take a step back, put your head up, and look around and see what's happening. Now, in the beginning, we talked about rescue task force and how in tactical settings, this is kind of where this typically applies, is that post-active killer event where agencies are starting to blend police and fire resources into a task force that can go into a warm zone to start treating and triaging people. And every there's a lot of training across the country that is making a best effort to sort of standardize this, but it looks different from place to place. And that's important because the capabilities are different from place to place. The personalities are different from place to place. The time involved, if you're in a rural area versus a metro area, how many hospitals there are, how many trauma centers there are, it can change things, right? But the concept, generally speaking, if you didn't hear, we talked about this, I think, at length in the Columbine episode. I mentioned that in the beginning.
Yep.
But the concept is that I would take a group of firefighters, we would go in and do as much as we could with the supplies that we have on our person, and then we would head out. And then we would grab more supplies and do it again, right? And what we're trying to do, if you look at the studies on trauma, there's some chart, and this is off the top of my head, so bear with me. But the chart basically says that this percentage of people die in the first couple of minutes post getting shot or, in some kind of traumatic event. This percentage of people will survive for a number of hours, right? However many hours that is, I don't know, but they could survive a long time before they really look at long-term mortality. And then there's this percentage of people that you've got like a 5 minutes to 45 minutes or 5 minutes to 30 minutes window, something like that. Those are the people that you're really trying to get out and reach, right? And so the idea, again, is to try to touch as many people in that period of time as you can before the scene can be made safe and we can really start to roll through this in a conventional way. Now, where I'm going with that from a timing component is when we go quote unquote tactical, and you're talking active killer, right? Workplace, we'll say it's like an office building and it's a large place, right? Several floors, maybe not like skyscraper, but like it's a 3 or 4 or 5 story building. And law enforcement has to go clear this place, and I've got to go figure out how many patients I have. What becomes problematic with this process is I take a small group of firefighters in with my law enforcement team, and I've got basically a backpack full of supplies to work with. And one floor can take me 20 or 30 or 40 minutes to do. And if I've got to do all 4 floors, I don't know how many patients I have until we're 2, 3, 4 hours into this. And that's problematic, right? So going back to where I started this, that accountability thing, one of your primary objectives needs to be figuring out how many patients you have and trying to communicate that so that you can bring them to help as soon as possible. And I mentioned that specifically in the context of Rescue Task Force. If you find yourself doing any kind of training in your area about that, think about the time component, because that's huge.
Yeah. This is fundamentally a logistics problem. You're going to hear us say that over and over and over because you have to move around. You have to move stuff around. You have to move injured people around. And injured people are hard to move around, it turns out.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the final big principle, right? Is logistics. It's harder than it looks. Moving people is a pain in the ass. There's no way around that. And supplies are a pain, and getting cars in and out. One of the biggest thing, here's a logistics thing for you. You go to mass casualty incidents.
Parking.
Yeah.
Parking.
Yeah. And all the cops just go screaming in there. They're coming in hot, and they're not really caring about where they're parking because they're trying to get inside to go be a hero or whatever. And now the ambulances have to park a mile away. Well, what's the problem with trying to move people a mile down the road? It's a shit show, right? So fundamentally, as a principle, when it comes to logistics, casualty collection points. Something that came up in the San Bernardino active killer event. We did an episode where we interviewed Gary Schulke from the San Bernardino Police Department, and we talked about that event. It's a great episode. There's a lot of learning lessons to be had there. But one of the things that came up was they started a casualty collection point away from the building, and they found out that physical fitness became a factor in trying to move people from point A to point B. So it really speeds things up and helps you get organized if you can co-locate your patients in a casualty collection point so that everything happens in a centralized place, right? But you have to move people from point to point, and that can be a challenge. Turns out that's a lot of work. And if this is a problem that you think you might have to deal with, you need to identify ways around this, because it's great that you have your IFAC and that you carry a tourniquet, and you have all your kit. But when you have to start moving not just one guy, but several people out of a building, out to the parking lot, that can take a lot of work. One of the most efficient ways that I've seen for this is using a sked. A sked is basically a stretcher that's like a hard plastic shell that you can put someone on and drag them. And what I like about that is you can move people basically one person can move a body very, very easily with a sked. If you buy a good one, one of the legitimate skeds, they're actually rated for raising and lowering and all of that.
When Mike says sked, he's talking about SKEDCO, Skedco brand stretcher.
Yeah. And so there's other stretchers and backboards, tarps. We've used one. We've experimented one called a Mega Mover, which is basically like a disposable tarp with handles on it, and it's better than nothing. But the idea is, don't get so wrapped up in your IFAC EDC kit that you forget about just the basic having to move people from point A to point B. And having a flow, having a logistics flow to, okay, we're going to have a casualty collection point that's going to happen here. The ambulances are going to park here. They're going to come in this way and out that way. So traffic is all kind of flowing in one direction. If you could sort that out, it might not be hands-on with patients, right? If you're talking about being up in the getting your hands dirty and treating people, like sometimes if you could be out there directing traffic, that might be the most effective use of your time. You'd be surprised. So have a casualty collection point. Think about the logistics. How are you getting people in, resources wise, and how are you getting patients out? That's a huge component of this. So as we wrap up here, I want to hit a couple of safety considerations. Jim talked about like the plume of hazardous materials that could be in the air. Obviously, we covered the tactical stuff like post-active killer, warm zone. There could be a bad guy somewhere out there. Having more patients doesn't simplify your safety and security stuff, because it could be like herding cats, and people are disoriented and they're scared and they're not acting rationally, and they're sitting next to their coworkers or their buddies or their family members who might be dead or dying, and so that can be difficult. So it's hard enough as it is. You need to make sure that you're watching out for your own safety and your own security. So the tactical stuff is one thing. The plume of smoke that Jim talked about, there's a classic scenario that we would run for brand new EMTs when I worked on an ambulance back in the day, where like an EMT school or whatever, they tell you, hey, you're going to a sick person call, a person who's unresponsive, unknown cause. And you walk to the room and you open the door, and it's like a classroom type of setting or an office type of setting. And there's like 3 people down who are unresponsive. And that should be a clue, right? Everyone in that room is unresponsive. Why do you suppose that is? Was it because they were all shot and there's potentially a bad guy on the loose? Was it some kind of hazardous material like a poison or something, a gas in the air that caused all of them to go unresponsive? Do you want to insert yourself into that? And it's kind of an extreme example, right? There's a lot of context that's sort of missing from that, but it's something to think about. If everyone in an environment is sick, dead, or dying, that potentially suggests a hazard to you. So consider that. Another big one in stuff like this is structural, right? So a building collapse type of scenario, or, earthquake, 9/11, something like that. There's all kinds of structural concerns
Oklahoma
to worry
City
about.
was the same thing, right? Yeah. And along the lines of safety considerations, just bear in mind that the hot zone and the warm zone and the cold zone, those are concepts, those are ideas. They're not physical spaces, and they're not guarantees of safety, right? if there's an active shooter, the ship bag could decide to roll into your designated cold zone and make it real hot real fast. So you don't get to let your guard down just because you've called a thing a cold zone.
Well, that's absolutely a great point, because the same thing can happen. I use hazmat as an example. If you know what you're doing in a hazardous materials type of thing, the car crash on the freeway that causes a tanker to spill, right? And now you have this gas or liquid that's out in the air and it's toxic or something. Well, weather can come in and shift the wind on you. Mm-hmm. So you just have to be constantly reevaluating and reassessing things, which is a common thing in patient assessment and trauma care anyway, is to reassess. Okay, this person had bleeding that they put a tourniquet on themselves. When I get there and I go to treat that person, I'm going to check their tourniquet and make sure that it's still doing its job. You have a patient that had a tourniquet that was put on, and I'm going to move that guy. After I move him, I'm going to check it and make sure that didn't come loose, right? You're constantly reassessing that stuff. And the same is true when we talk about safety and security stuff, tactical, structural, hazardous materials, whatever. Those things can always change, right? The building might seem like it's secure right now. It's stable. It's not going to fall. And then suddenly things start jostling around and you realize, hey, maybe we should get the F out of here, right? How about that? Something you got to be prepared for. So,
yeah.
Basic principles, again, trauma and triage aren't really all that different. We're building on these concepts, but what I'm going for in this episode is for you to understand cognitively how to avoid being overwhelmed. And if you have a model or a system in place for dealing with these sort of mass casualty, whether it's rescue task force related or it's just a triage mass casualty protocol that you use, the stuff that's black and white on a whiteboard or on paper in a manual somewhere, you have to think about the human elements. How do you apply that? So that's kind of where I'm at on this, is I want you to think past the policies and procedures and into the more cognitive stuff. Trauma doesn't change just because there are more patients. Trauma care is trauma care, right? Bright lights and cold steel. That's what saves lives in a lot of these cases. Some people need life-saving interventions or certain treatments to buy them the time. And the rest, oftentimes, really what they need is for you to do a good job managing the problem and managing the scene well enough to get the help to happen, right? To get to that end state. And again, things like traffic control. Hey, you know what they need? Ambulances. So why don't you bring some ambulances over up in here, right? So if you can manage those things and make it happen, you're increasing the odds of survival for everyone there. And that becomes a lot less medical, doesn't it? It's not really a break out my kit problem. It's a just let's look at the traffic situation problem, right? So consider that. And because of that, it also becomes more of a teamwork, leadership, communication exercise. And those are the warm and fuzzies that we're really trying to capture. A big part of teamwork as it relates to dealing with these sorts of things is figuring out where the bottlenecks are. There's the physical bottlenecks, like moving people from point A to point B and where do people park and stuff like that. But there's also other bottlenecks, like how do I avoid reassessing the same 15 patients and not finding the rest on other parts of the building or other parts of the campus? One of those things is like you need to have an incident commander type or someone who can sit down and say, these are the areas that have been checked and dealt with. These are the areas that haven't.
There's a reason there's a whole incident command structure, right? There's a reason you have the fancy colored vests and fancy colored tags and whiteboards, is because there's an organization that you have to force on to a chaotic scene.
Yeah.
If you've got the time and you got the resources, do that. There's been a lot of time and effort put into that.
But understand, too, that it's not, before we get to the tarps and the vests and the helmets and all that, you have to have your wits about you to think about organizing that, which means you can't be too bogged down in, oh my God, I got to stop this bleeding right here. I got to get this person out of this car that's stuck, that's trapped. You need to be able to take that step back, that emotional detachment, and say, all right, hold on a second, like this is more than 3 guys can handle. One of us needs to take a step back and start coordinating the big picture stuff. That's important, right? So trauma's trauma. Your care doesn't really change, just the timelines and the logistics change. Principle number 1. Number 2 is accountability. You need a good assessment of the problem. You have to figure out what exactly do you have, and you have to communicate that effectively. And then 3, you have to make your logistics. There's the resources that you have and the resources that you need. Sometimes those are not the same numbers. You have to figure out how to manage that, right? So work the logistics and think about that. And sometimes that means not doing all the cool shit you were taught to do, you were trained to do. Sometimes it's the least sexy stuff that is the most important. The last thing that I want you to take from this is think about those smaller scale incidents as opportunities to practice and get ready for it. You know, the active killer scenario, the Las Vegas attack, that's like the Super Bowl of this thing. And how many games does an NFL star play before they make it to the Super Bowl? You have to learn along the way here, right? And so don't lose sight of that. Think about the small stuff to make you good at the big stuff. And I think that's all I got.
Yeah, I would say you got to get good enough at the fundamentals that you can do them well even when it gets weird, right? You have to manage forest and trees. You have to understand the details and then also pop your head up every once in a while, get that good scene assessment. Use your resources, and that might include bystanders and victims. And you might have to make the scene safe or move people to a safer part of the scene so that you can get that rescue asset to them, right? It's fundamentally a logistics problem. It's a planning problem. And you've got to be able to scale it from the rolled over Honda Civic to 9/11. And this is your problem no matter what your job is. I'm a sniper. That's wonderful you're a sniper. Today, you're the guy holding pressure on this femoral artery, right?
Get heavy.
I don't have to worry about that. I'm a patrol cop. Guess what, patrol cop? This is totally your problem until we can get more specialized assets there, right? Jack of all trades. So, and on the civilian side, it might be your family right in the middle of this. I have a bro who was in a boat accident. He was on a houseboat on a river, and their houseboat crashed into another houseboat. He literally lost like half his family that day. And he was sitting there doing his combat casualty care skills on his father-in-law, trying to stop the bleeding. And, you know, having the fundamentals right, even when things get weird, is the name of the game. So cheering you on, prioritize your efforts, understand that sometimes that means making tough calls. That's all I got. Good luck out there.
Yep. Nothing about trauma. Nothing about mass casualty and triage is easy. So be good at those basics before you ever get to it. All right, guys, that's all we got for tonight. This episode is brought to you by Drip Drop. Drip Drop Oral Rehydration Solution is an electrolyte powder that you mix with water. It was formulated by a doctor for quick absorption. I work in the desert, and it only takes a few hours in the heat, wearing body armor, carrying around a bunch of gear before I start feeling like crap and fall behind the curve in dehydration. Drip Drop keeps you in the fight so you can finish the mission and rehab for the next one. Go get you some at dripdrop.com or on Amazon, or ask your supply guy to find it for you.
This episode is also brought to you by Manisex. You're not going to get better at shooting on your own. You need practice, you need data, you need coaching. You need to make the most of your ammo with good live and dry fire training. Manus is a family of training devices that helps you track your movements while you train. It times and tracks everything you do in a shooting drill and coaches you as you go. You can find them on manisex.com.
Don't forget that we put out new episodes on the 1st and the 15th of every month. If you like what we're doing, you can head over to Patreon, give us $1 for each new episode. That money's going to go back into bringing you good content. If you want to interact with us, you could find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We are at TacTangents. You can also email info@tacticaltangents.com. And one last thing, our Facebook discussion group. We've got a little group going on Facebook. If you go to the groups tab on our page, you can join it. We've got more followers on our page than we have in the group. So I know there's some of you out there following the Facebook page that are on Facebook that are not in the group. Lots of like-minded people in there. So come hang out with us. All right. That's all we got. Good talk.